scene.
There we go. Okay. Oops. Too little. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Jerry Burnell, are you sitting at your computer? I don't know where he's at. He's been logged in since 6:30.
Looks like he's in the middle of a field with a bunch of.
A bunch of elk and buffalo. All right. I am just going to share my Lightroom. Okay. That should work. And I'll close this up so I don't have all this extra stuff open. All right, so last time we were here, Lightroom class. Last time we were here, we were talking about the tools in Lightroom, and we got through the crop. We looked at the mask, did a couple of things with the masking tool. I talked about the red eye, and I talked about the clone and heal tool a little bit. And Greg and I, before 7, we were talking about the clone and heal tool because and Bruce, I'm interested to know your thoughts on this, but I typically don't use this tool much in Lightroom because I still think that Adobe has work to do on it, and I prefer to use the process in Photoshop. What do you think, Bruce?
Normally, I do too. I just upgraded Lightroom to 11.4, and for some reason the clone and heal tool seems to be working better.
What am I on? Yeah, I'm on the 11.4 version.
It surprised. In fact, it was so good it surprised me.
They have been
And
improving it.
what I've normally found is sometimes it works real well and sometimes it doesn't work at all, and that tells you when it's time to go to Photoshop.
Yeah, yeah. And like Greg, I was showing Greg a picture and just doing an example of something I was trying to remove, and in Lightroom it was too big of an area to remove and get the computer, the AI, to realize what I needed to put there, and then in another picture it just wasn't capable of doing it. But as soon as I put it in Photoshop, it pretty much made it go away. But
Right.
so kind of a hit and miss, just to play with it. I do, when I use that tool, I do typically do a lot of feather, because if you don't do the feather and you do a hard line or a close to a hard line and the match isn't exact on color, you will absolutely see whatever it is, it took its place of what you were trying to cover up or get rid of. So, and obviously if you use the opacity and you drop it down, you're going to be able to see through whatever Lightroom puts in its place. So just for an example, I'll put my feather up, but I'll drop my opacity down, and then we'll zoom in on this right here. So let's say for some strange reason I wanted to get rid of this. So if my opacity is not down all the way, or if my opacity is not up all the way, rather, you can see whatever it is behind the object that I tried to get rid of. And because I have this tool overlay down here, I have it selected, so I'm showing, because if I don't show it, I can't tell where Lightroom picked the cover up from. So if I do use the heal and clone tool, I do turn that on because I want to see where it's grabbing from, especially if it's not a great match. Say for instance, though, I wanted to, for whatever reason, put this building on top of that building like that, and then bring my opacity up so I can cover up the spires. I can see where it's at, or I can say, yeah, I kind of like that area. I can line up the clouds a little bit there. So now it maybe looks like, I don't know, maybe they're in fog. I guess you could could say it's foggy in Vegas, covering up the spires.
Yeah, that happens.
So that's just the biggest thing is make sure you're using the feather, and make sure that if you're wanting to actually cover something up, you've got your opacity all the way up, because if you don't, it's not going to work. You're going to see through it. And if you're doing like retouch stuff on somebody's face, let's see if I've got a face here. This one is one that we had. So this kid's got, you know, a few blemishes. If you wanted to replace them, you really want your tool to be the size of whatever it is you're going to cover up, because that's going to give you the smallest area of disturbance. And if you don't like what you get, you can move the piece around that it's choosing, and you can go through and do one of those make a plastic doll games and get rid of every single blemish on somebody's face. If you use a bigger spot, you're going to see it. So that's why I say use the smallest spot you can to make it fit, because it'll be easier for the AI to figure out how to cover it up, and it'll be a lot less noticeable. So that is one thing that I use this for in Lightroom, is if I'm doing a face retouch of somebody, or I just have a, like, say for instance, you've got dust on your camera lens. I think this is Barry's picture. Turn off. So there's a way to show dust. Let's see if I can remember it. Bruce, do you know the trick on dust?
Oh, you got to, you don't have it. Do you have the tool open? The healing tool open?
Yep. Visualize spots. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, have it open.
So if you have a picture, like say you're doing landscape photography, and maybe you don't see any dust on your image. Maybe your monitor and the way you've got things set, or it's just really not very noticeable. You can search for the dust.
All right, that was me. That was a little crack of thunder there.
Yeah, we have a little bit of thunder going on. So
if I disappear, you'll know why.
if you've got dust on your sensor and you pull this down, you're still going to see the dust, because it's going to have a white overlay on it like these do. It's going to show as an object in the background. And I don't know. My sensor's pretty clean considering all the dirt that I shoot around, but I'm pretty careful. But I do get dust on my lens, or on my sensor. So, you know, if you get into a picture and you start seeing that you've got sensor dust and you've got a spot somewhere and you're not sure if there's any other places, or you're not sure that you got the only one, you can turn on the Heal Clone tool. And then down here, right above your thumbnail strip, is the Visualize Spots button. And you can just turn it on and then work your sliders. Work this slider right here. And if there's a spot, it's going to show up. You'll see it. And then you can use your Heal or Clone tool to get rid of it in Lightroom, and it's really easy. So that's a neat little thing. I didn't even know that Lightroom did that, Bruce, until about 2 months ago. Learned something new. Okay, so we'll go back to the tools. So one of the things we went over, we did kind of touch on the sliders here. And Randy asked about the tonal curve. Hi, David. And I do use the tonal curve.
Hi.
So I use the tonal curve for color, but I also use it if my image is really underexposed like this one is. I usually try to get as much of the exposure right using these 4 sliders here, before I start playing with other things. So like on this one, I would pull my shadows up, and I can do the, you know, we talked about holding the shift button down and clicking on shadow and letting the AI make the decisions. And that's a great way to start, because that takes you to where the AI thinks the image is needing to be. And I think it's still a little dark. So I can, you know, I can pull up my exposure if I want to, but I can also go down here and I can pick a center point somewhere between here and here, like just at the top of the shadows before I get into the highlights, and I can click a point and I can pull it up. And that lightens up the image too. And I don't know, you guys.
How is that any different than just running up the exposure slider?
So I'll show you. All right, so I've got my histogram over here. This is another thing that I didn't go over last week or last time. Your histogram is broken up just like your sliders. So in the middle, you have your exposure. So if I click right here, see it's moving my exposure slider. And if I go down to the next area that it highlights, that's my shadows. And obviously over here is my black. And then to the right of the exposure, I've got my highlights. And then at the end, I've got my whites. So I really want this to be a mountain more here or spread across rather than crammed all the way over on the left or all the way over on the right. So if I reset my exposure, if I just move my exposure over, it's moving my mountain, it's moving everything here, but I'm going to take this back and I'm going to pull this up instead. And it does alter the colors, and you can move it around. So this one does not affect the tone of the image as much as the sliders above. This one protects your tonal qualities, whereas the sliders up here will affect the tone a lot more. So that's the image with the exposure change. And that's the image with the slider change. Let me make a duplicate. Reset. All right. Come on. Okay. So we are going to, right now I've got it so the AI has everything set the way the AI wants it. So I'm gonna, if you get settings and you have two pictures that you want to apply the same changes to, so for instance, this is the one that this is my original and this is my copy. So I have the settings on my original and I want to apply those to another picture. In this instance, it's my copy. I'm going to hold the shift key down. I'm going to select that second image, and then I'm going to go over here at the bottom of my sliders on the right, and I'm going to hit sync. And it's going to bring this up, and you're going to have all these different boxes to check. And I let it check, I let it change all of these except for the transformations, because sometimes the images are not the same. The effects, because sometimes I don't want to apply the post-crop vignette and the grain. You should also don't duplicate your spot removal change, because it'll be weird. I had some that I did that on because they were in the same place on a tripod and the spot was in the same spot, so it worked. But I also don't let it do my crop. I don't let it do the calibration, and I don't let it do the masking. If you do that because you have the same images, for instance, on a tripod, and then you go in and you forget to uncheck those on your next shoot, you will start seeing very strange things happening to some of your images. So I just do the ones that really affect the exposure and the color, so that they kind of all look the same from an eye view rather than a size and angles. Then you hit synchronize, and then it puts the same settings on both pictures. So that one and that one, they are exactly the same. All right, so now we're gonna kick up. We'll put that at 1.5, and on this one I'm gonna pull this up. Now because I'm in the middle, I'm just pulling up the shadows. So notice it's not as bright, but if I come over here and grab the top, see, it's making it flat. It's really not the same effect. No matter what I do here, I'm not going to get the same effect as if I was. So this is where, when you click on this one that looks like a little S for the adjust, that's going to be the one that brings up the sliders. There isn't an exposure slider. There is only highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. And you can pull this up all you want, but it's still going to look different because it protects the colors a little bit more than using the exposure itself. So if I don't want to mess up my colors, my tones, I can just leave the exposure right there, or I can bring it up a little bit, but then I can use the slider to do more. And you can really impact the image by moving sliders around here and pulling things in these settings. Then you can and you can put different points here. You can grab it in multiple places. So that one is with some small changes. Let me put this back. There. So you can see that messing with your S is kind of weird. So it's just really different. The exposure is not going to protect your color as much. I do pull up my exposure if I am purposely underexposing an image to avoid a lot of grain, a lot of noise in the image. I will frequently pull up my exposure to a point anywhere between a 0.25 to 0.5, but then I will go to this tool and use the tonal curve so that I can get everything to work the way I need it to work. And then I go into the next step. So let's say, for instance, that this one is just really poorly lit and it's really dark and I need to fix it. I can pull up my highlights to bring up the sky. I can pull up my shadows. I can pull up my whites if I want to. I'm starting to get things coming out and get my blacks. Things are still kind of dark down on the bottom. So we have these next set of the presence of texture, clarity, and dehaze. So the texture tool will give you more definition in things like buildings and grass, flying dirt, wheat field, things, bird feathers, things that you want texture to, but it doesn't affect the contrast of the image. So if you run it, let's see. I'll give you a for instance. I'll use somebody's, I think this is somebody's picture that was entered in N4C. So if you pull up this bird and you pull up the texture, it starts giving you a lot more definition around the feathers and the eye, but it affects the whole image because I'm applying that slider to the entire image. That slider is available in the mask set. If I were to use my mask tool and select subject, it'll select the bird, and then I can use that same texture tool on just the bird and it doesn't affect the water or whatever else is in the background. I can also go the other direction and smooth it. So if you have a model, for instance, that has really big pores and you happen to be using a Sony A9 that shows every single pore on their body, even if you're 50 feet away, you can smooth out the skin. You don't want to go too much because then you get that porcelain doll look, but you can smooth it out a little bit to make those pores not so noticeable. you just really want to be careful. On this particular image, let's see, zoom out. So if I get all the colors where I want them, and I want to increase the texture in my building, but not in my sky, I can just use the mask tool, because I can tell it to select the sky, and then I can just invert the mask, and then I can pull my texture up, and it's only giving me texture in the buildings. So it's not touching my sky. And you can do the same thing with clarity. The difference between texture and clarity is clarity affects the contrast and the saturation. I will go back to my person that you guys have. So if I change my texture, notice in the wood right here in front of him and on this door, if I pull my texture all the way up, the detail in the wood comes out. And I don't have him selected because I'm just doing the example for the wood. But notice that the color doesn't change of the wood. It stays the same. Now, if I pull the clarity up, it changed the whole image a lot. It changed the contrast in the wood, and it also changed the tone. It changed all of the color in the whole image. And because I don't have any masks applied, obviously, but if you see, I've got my histogram set, so it shows me if I'm turning my blacks out or if I'm blowing out my whites. So when I pull that clarity up, it's showing me not only am I making more black areas go away and lose data, I'm also pulling my whites up at the same time, because it's changing the tone of the image, it's changing the contrast of the image, and you have a contrast slider, and you can do the same thing on contrast, except you won't get the definition in the wood grain. So now that they've got the texture tool, I rarely use the clarity tool for much because it changes so much. So then you've got, turn these off. You've got your dehaze tool. The dehaze tool is designed to get rid of haze. Like if you lived in San Francisco or Chicago or even Wichita on a weird fire smoky day, you could get rid of haze. But it also does a couple of other things. It darkens the image. It changes the color of the image because it's changing the contrast, and it changes the saturation of the image. And I don't recommend doing this, but I had to use a entry-level DSLR for an indoor event, and the lighting was pretty terrible. And no matter what I did, I couldn't get great, like it was either I was going to have really, really noisy pictures because I had to pump everything up so high to get the exposure right, or I had to underexpose it and fix it in post. So one of the things that you can do, it's just not great if you're in that situation, is you can pull the dehaze the other way, but you can't go very far. It's not like an exposure where you can just yank it all the way over to the, halfway to the left and say it's great, because again, it affects your color, your tone, your contrast. It affects everything in the image. So if you're thinking that it's a tool that you can use to help the exposure because you had to underexpose it or you just couldn't get it where you wanted it, it's going to take you the wrong direction. But it can save you a little bit if you stay around the -15 to 20 mark. It can help a little. It's just not great, but it's there. I do use this one quite a bit. I usually am somewhere between, I don't really pay that close attention to it, but I think I'm usually somewhere between 20 and 30 on the settings. And I do that because in the motorcycle stuff, it helps with the contrast and bringing out some of the detail, and sometimes, helping make the sky pop, especially if it's a not quite a blue day, but not quite super gray. If you're going to use it on portraits, I would recommend applying that mask because especially on women, if you pull a dehaze tool on a female, it is going to make her look like she's some sort of a freak model. So do your mask on your subject and then invert the mask with the little invert button, and then you can pull your dehaze and fix whatever it is around it you're wanting to fix. I just don't apply it to people. It works great on animals. Like this little dude, I don't know who took this one. This was another one from the club that we were looking at. But you know, look at what it does to the background. It's affecting the meerkat too. But it's really kind of cool how it affects the background. And it doesn't really pull any of the highlights out of his fur right here. And the clarity and the texture one are really noticeable in this picture too. So if you pull the clarity all the way up, it gets really, it just looks really sharp, I guess is the good way to say it. But the texture tool is different. It sharpens it, but it doesn't do as much because it doesn't change the contrast. Are there any questions about these tools or the curve? All right.
I might note that one thing that the dehaze does by its nature, it applies blue to the image. You don't always notice it, but there is a way you can work around that by unbluing the image, going down to the
Hsl.
And decrease the blue.
Yeah, I'll use those a lot too. We'll get into that tonight because I know that the color stuff is really confusing. So the vibrance and the saturation. Vibrance and saturation are the same but not the same, because saturation affects every color in the entire image across the board, regardless of what it's on. And you can get rid of all the color, or you can just kind of fade it out, but you can really make it weird. The vibrance is run by the AI on the software. So the vibrance, the AI says, what do we need to affect and what shouldn't we affect? So if you have a portrait picture specifically, and you want to pull the colors, you want to make the picture more vibrant, but you don't want to affect the person, without creating a mask, you can start to adjust the vibrance in the picture, and the person changes just a little bit, but really the skin tones are really left alone, because you can see that I'm pulling this and he's getting a little bit of a yellowish hue on his cheeks, but I'm really taking this quite a ways, because I'm going up to like 40 and 50 where you start seeing the change. You know, I can go to there and I'm still comfortable with his skin tone, and I'm at 24, 25, and that's about what I run. But if you move the saturation slider, put this back to 24 or 25, you're getting a pretty drastic change in skin color. He's turning pretty yellow. So the vibrance is supposed to not affect the skin tone. If you go too far, it will. But if you just need to, you know, and you can always apply the mask. Again, we have this handy dandy mask tool, and we don't have the vibrance and the saturation here, but we have saturation right here. So you can apply the saturation, and the vibrance tool is not in the mask for a reason, because if you're applying a mask, Adobe assumes that you're going to mask off what you want the saturation to affect. So you don't need the AI system to help you. So you can pull up your colors in the saturation, and then you have this hue slider, which is kind of a cool tool. Let's see if I can get out of my zoom. Okay, so we're going to see if we can change this a little bit. The hue slider is going to change the colors. So it's changing, specifically, it's changing my yellows and my oranges right now. Because you notice the blue is staying the same. The shirt rather is not changing. So it's picking the color that is the most prominent in the image and changing it. And you have a fine adjustment, and all that does is slow down like how fast this slider moves. So it's like a micro adjustment. I don't use these settings in the mask because I try to get the color where I want it before I have to, like, I try not to use my mask to adjust the color. Sometimes you have to do it. It's handy to have it, handy to know how to use it. And color is one of those things where once you start changing it, if you don't have an idea of where it needs to go and you're kind of taking yourself down a path of, I'll stop when I get to where it looks great, you may spend days looking at that picture. So, color's weird. You can use the tonal curve to work on colors because you have your red, which is red on the bottom and teal on the, or red top, teal on the bottom, your green, which is green on the top, and
Magenta.
magenta, thanks, on the bottom, and then you've got your blue and your yellow. So if you start moving this slider, moving this tonal curve, you're affecting the whole image again. It's a full effect across the board. But you can change, for instance, if you go up here to the top, you're only affecting the highlights because up at the top is the highlights. If you go down to the bottom, you're affecting your shadows. And in the middle, you're doing all your midtones. And it's a good way to remember this tonal curve. You've got your highlights, your whites, darks, highlights, and your shadows, and then your midtones. Okay. Oh, this does also have a point curve in case you just want to let Lightroom do what it thinks is best. It's got 3 of them here: linear, medium, and strong. I've never used those, but they're there. You can also use this little tool right here. There's a little dot right here. So let's say you've got a place on this. I'm going to reset this. Let's say you've got a place on this image that you want to increase the lighting and make it brighter. You can click on that spot and it'll move that curve for you. You can do the same thing on the colors. You can click that little thing so it's highlighted. And then, like, let's say I want to change his blue. Now it's affecting the blue. It's affecting the whole image, but it's specifically pointed at that blue where I put the dot. So it's basing its changes on that spot. So that's kind of a neat tool. If you do something and you want to toggle it, you can turn it off and on. You can also use the backslash to see your before and after, original and current. So you can see where you're at in your editing. All right, so I'm going to turn that off. We're going to go back to where we were. All right, the Hsl and Color Tool. You can look at these one topic at a time, or you can hit all and it'll just show you a big giant list of them. They all do something a little bit different. So we'll start with the hue. The hue changes specific colors to more saturated or towards a different color scheme. For instance, if you click on red, it looks like I don't really have a lot of red here, but just for fun, we'll take the red to the right and see if anything changes. I'm not really seeing a lot of change. Maybe a little bit on his skin. Okay, here's the orange. So if I want to change my orange and make it a little bit more yellow, I can go to the right, and you'll see right up here is where the big change is going to happen. So if I go down, it almost turns it to a red. Then I can go back up here and play with it up here. or I can go extreme and almost turn it to a greenish yellow. You can use this little tool again here and change it. So if I want this blue to be a different color, I can click and drag, and it's only going to affect the blue. Notice it's not changing the rest of the image. And that's because I selected this little guy and it said, oh, you want me to pick a specific color. What color do you want? And I said, hey, pick blue. And it recognizes that I'm on blue and it's moving the blue slider. Notice on the right, it's also moving the purple slider just a little bit because the AI says it's not a true blue, it's got purple in it. So it's moving 2 sliders, but the blue one is moving all the way across and the purple's just moving a little bit. So you can change colors. If you had this image and you don't like pink, or you really like pink, I think James Mitchell would be extremely offended if he saw this. So there's his yellow flamingos. And then you can go into the saturation tool and really make things wild. And then go to your luminance tool. So again, you can screw things up a lot if you desire, or you can, I recommend when you're changing, when you're working in the HSL, you do it in small increments on specific colors, or use the help tool to get you started, because as soon as you start popping sliders right and left and going back and forth, you'll end up either resetting the image or just getting up and walking away. But I remember back in the first session, I mentioned that Canon oversaturates reds and oranges. So when you have an image that's got something oversaturated, such as the reds and the oranges, the saturation settings come in handy because you don't have to pull it all the way down to fix it. You can just pull it a little bit and it will decrease that saturation level. I don't think I already fixed these, but if you just pull it down a little, it's not pulling the color out, it's just taming it down a little bit. So that's one way to use it. So the other cool thing is I could change an image to black and white, right? Super easy to do. I just hit this button up here right above the basics. You've got color in black and white. I can hit it black and white. That's great. But the other thing that I can do is I can pull saturation down one slider at a time to see what I like and what I don't like. And Sandra Berry, and some of you know Sandra and some of you don't. She hasn't been to a meeting in quite a while, but she does a lot of stuff in black and white, and she frequently will pull the sliders down rather than just switch it to a black and white so that she can see what colors are where and how they affect the image. And then once she's got the image down to a black and white, then she uses the Luminance tool to change how those colors affect the image from a black and white standpoint, because you can destroy it pulling it one way or the other, but you can really see what it changes. And if you're gonna, like, say for instance, you're gonna enter an N4C black and white competition, you can do the same thing by using the black and white tool to switch it, but you're not seeing what each color is affecting one by one. So if you use the sliders to kind of train yourself on how black and white works, you'll understand a little bit better as to, you know, it's not just the yellow light, there's a lot of other yellow tones and things that you don't see. And then you can start moving other sliders around to figure out what's going to work best for that image. Because you'll see that sometimes you'll pull something one way and it'll really distort the color, but it's in black and white, so it really just distorts the shape instead of the color. Okay, reset. All right, so we went over the hue, Saturation, obviously, if you go the other direction, it's really gonna change everything and you're gonna enter another world, potentially Mars. And then your luminance is how light or how dark that color is. So let's go back to the kid. So the blue that he's wearing, if I want it darker, I'm just going to make it darker. Again, I'm not affecting the whole image, but you can see where the blue is though. See this board right here, specifically on the door? No one probably would have guessed that there was blue in that wood. But if I change the blue, it changes the wood. If I go the other way, it does the same thing because there's a blue tint to that wood. And it's probably not like, I mean, I know it's not paint because I've seen the door in person, but it's just the coloring in the wood fibers itself. And if you move a different slider thinking that you want to change something, you can make it lighter or darker. Any questions over these tools? Okay. Photoshop got rid of split toning. So if you see split toning in your Photoshop, in your Lightroom, then you probably have a little bit older version. They introduced color grading. I'm not good with color grading. If you use a lot of free presets, you'll find that the presets frequently have color grading introduced into them. So we do have a few ways you can look at the color grading tool. You have the 3 dots that gives you your midtones, your shadows, and your highlights. And then you can blend them and you can balance them. And it looks like the storm might have bumped Ken. He's trying to get back in. You can also click and just see the shadows or the midtones or the highlights. And then there's a global option that changes all of them at the same time. And you can adjust the luminance of all of them at the same time. So this is another one of those things where you kind of want to have an idea of where you want to go with it, because you could spend all day playing with it and end up going back to where you started. So we'll go to this one. All right, highlights. A little bit is a lot. And remember, I'm only on the highlights right now. So I kind of like the color of the sky right about there, maybe. And then if I wanted to change my shadows or my dark areas, I could pick a color. And again, a little bit is a lot. And then you could adjust your midtones if you wanted to. I do tend to gravitate towards the blue when I do these. And you can see I'm changing, this is my luminance slider here. So I'm changing the luminance so it's lightening things up rather than making it darker. And you can blend it all together. You can really throw the balance off. So I watched a video on the color grading when it came out, and one of the recommendations was that you have a color wheel so that you understand what colors go together if you've never looked at a color wheel before. Because if you start going opposite directions or at a 90-degree or 45-degree off that color wheel, your colors are going to get pretty wonky. But if you use a color wheel, it can help you kind of keep things go in the same direction. Bruce, do you use the color grading much?
No, you can still do split toning. Split toning is just highlights and shadows. And a good way to kind of introduce yourself to it is if you have a preset that applies split toning, go ahead and apply it to an image and then open up the color grading panel and look at the changes that were made, and you'll quickly see how you can still do split toning with the color grading. But to answer your question, no, I don't use it much.
If I have a preset that does split toning.
Well, I happen to have a bunch, and I don't particularly like them, but they're good to learn color grading with. Color grading is not for the timid.
I would agree with that. I do not enjoy color grading, but I really just haven't played with it. It's just not something that I get into. But it's another tool. Okay, detail. So this is another area where you can really work the image in two directions. So you're going to have your sharpening. I pre-sharpen when I import my pictures. I put them at I believe I have it at a 45 or a 47 for sharpening. So they come in pre-sharpened already. But you can sharpen an image, and the sharpening will just bring out detail. Now I will say that I would recommend using these two settings close to last, because they take a lot of processing and they will look like they're done and they're not done, and you will keep using them because you think they're not done, and then all of a sudden things are really out of whack because you've taken the sliders so far because you don't think that it's enough, and next thing you know you've got too much. But they take a lot of RAM, so I usually use the sharpening and the noise reduction last. But if you sharpen something because you're trying to get more effect out of, say, the architecture, notice how much grain and noise it put on my image. So one of the things that I can do here is I can tell it to adjust the radius of the sharpening, bigger or smaller. I can tell it to have more detail or less detail. And then I can apply a mask. So if I hold my, if I hold my option button down, which I believe is the
Alt
button on the Windows, thank you. And then I pick this masking tool and I slide it. And I slide it until the sky is dark. What it's doing is it's removing that sharpening from all of the highlight areas, and it's only sharpening the midtones and the shadows and the sharp areas that I want, such as the buildings. So my sky is not as grainy as it was. Oh, thanks. Go away. All right. So if I bring this back down, you can see, I don't know, how well can you guys see the grain in the sky? There, is that better?
Well,
So if I pull this back over to where I had it, see, most of the grain in the sky went away. And then I can do a noise reduction. And now all of the grain from the sky is gone. I have some gray on I have some noise on my buildings, but it's not as bad as it was. And my image is not, it's sharp, but it's not noisy. Topaz Ai has a software that essentially does the same thing. It's a little bit more confusing because it has a lot more sliders to play with, but you can mask as much as you want. The downside is if you have a lot of noise and it's a picture with people, you're going to lose a lot of effect if you use this. Let me turn this back down to 200. So say for some reason I wanted to sharpen my person. I'm getting the getting the grain on him and I'm getting it every place else. I apply the mask. It pulls the grain away. And then I apply the noise reduction. It on him, it's not terrible. It does give me a little bit more of that, again, porcelain doll look, much as if I played with my texture tool. See how the texture is removing some of that luminance noise reduction that I just put on it. It's also turning him into a doll. But that is another way to get rid of noise, is you're sharpening with your mask and then your noise reduction. And you can tell it to allow more detail. Again, these are really, really big RAM hogs. So if your sliders are on your detail, your contrast, your color, all that stuff is all the way over on the left, and you apply the noise reduction is going to get rid of noise. If you want to bring some detail back to try and avoid the noise, but make it more detailed, like if it's a face, for instance, and you can bring your detail sliders back out and you can bring the contrast back out, and it'll start to give you some more of the features, such as the eyelashes and the things like that. And then it also affects the color, so you can tell it to bring the color back too. Usually if I'm applying this, it's because I took a picture at night at the motocross track and my ISO was higher than I liked it to be. So I apply it to the whole image and I don't worry about masking it because there's no people that I need to worry about taking any features away from. I don't use the sharpening tool much because, again, I pre-sharpen when I upload my images. So is there anybody that doesn't sharpen their images? Hi,
Yeah,
Jerry.
I never thought about it, to be honest. I guess I don't understand how it's different than like the texture or something.
Well, it adds a different level of, and because mine are pre-sharpened, it might be a little bit harder to show it.
I usually sharpen because I'm using these very wide angle lenses for the VR, and they're very soft.
Yeah.
And so I like to bring out some of the detail.
I don't think that I have anything, because this one's not mine. But a lot of the landscape, and we can look at some images at the next meeting, or you can go on to the club page and you can tell when somebody has over sharpened the image versus use the clarity tool too far or use the texture tool too far. Because
Okay, so this one is mine, so it hasn't been sharpened.
this one's yours. Okay, cool. I got lucky. All right, so you're not going to see a drastic change here. All right, so right now I have no sharpening. And there's 90. You see the difference?
Not really.
Look at his nose. This is
Yeah, I can see it.
There's with the sharpening, there's without.
Okay.
It's not huge. Right?
It's making it lighter, I guess, more than anything, what I'm seeing.
Yeah. It's bringing out some of the detail on his nose. It's making the texture and the highlights and the darks all kind of pop. If I pull the sharpening down and use this tool instead, it's changing a lot. Because it's adding contrast, so it's making those darks really dark.
Yeah.
If I pull the texture tool instead, I'm getting a little bit of change. I really like the texture tool. That's probably the thing that I use the most as far as trying to get detail to come out. You know, I mean, I pre-sharpen, but I don't use the sharpen slider very often once I'm in Lightroom because I've already pre-sharpened. But you can see that the texture tool is changing over here on his eye. It's changing his nose. It's changing his whiskers. Because all this stuff over here, to me, looks really soft on my screen. But as soon as I apply the texture, it kind of pops out.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I apply the sharpening tool, it affects it, but it doesn't affect it as much. Reset. If you want to create because I've done this a couple times and didn't explain what I did. If you want to create a copy of your image, you just right click and create a virtual copy. Now you have two copies of the same picture. One's the original and one's a copy. They're exactly the same. So if I take the texture all the way up on this one and I take the sharpening all the way up, or up to like 100 on this one, and then I use my RA.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you still
Pretty close. I don't know that from a judging standpoint, if I was looking at these, I'd be able to tell you which one was sharpened and which one is the texture, unless I was looking at the Lightroom screen and knowing which one I changed. But there is a little bit of difference. There's a little bit of color difference right in here, but it's pretty close.
Yeah. Okay.
The background is sharper on the left one.
Yeah. The background is a little different. All right. Moving on. Lens corrections. We're going to use this one. Go back to this. Okay. Lens corrections are really good to use, especially if you're doing landscape and architecture, city, stuff like that, or say for instance, my 24-70 that I have for my DSLR, for some reason when I use the converter to apply it on my mirrorless, I get a little bit of a vignette around the corners that I don't particularly care for. And that's one of the things that lens corrections can fix for you. If you're on the profile section, it'll remove what they call a chromatic aberration. And I think that this picture has a pretty heavy chromatic aberration. Can't see it too bad. But the chromatic aberration is something that you get around the edges and around trees. Like, that's not a very good example. I don't know if I have a great example of anything with chromatic aberrations. Everything I've gotten here is weird. I have an image on my wall that I took with a point and shoot camera, and I had it in Lightroom and it looked really cool. So I decided to print it, and I printed it at 11:14. And when I got it, I was pretty disgusted that I didn't pay attention to the detail at the top of my mountain, because I had a really bad chromatic aberration. There was like a green blue band right at the top edge right here. And I could have gotten rid of it had I zoomed in and paid close attention to it. So if you're using the profile, you can tell the software, the AI, to remove the chromatic aberration for you. And then you can tell it to apply the lens corrections. For instance, the weird vignette that I get with my 24-70, this picture I took with the Tamron, when I click on Tamron, it recognizes what lens I was actually using, 28-75. And it'll automatically take distortion and vignetting out for you. If you don't like what it came up with, you can adjust it a little bit. So if you're getting a fisheye look from a lens, this is where you would try to correct that potentially. And if you're getting that weird vignette, you can see in the upper right and the lower left specifically on this image, if I pull my vignette down all the way, it really enhances the vignette on those two corners, but not as much on the opposites. or you can use the manual. And this is where you would defringe to get rid of those chromatic color things that occur. If you have pictures of trees and they're in the distance, you might notice like a purple line right on the edge of the tree, or a blue line, or a green line right on the edge of the tree. And you can use this tool to defringe the colors. I did this on another image earlier and it worked. Let's see. Everything I have is pit bikes, guys. Such a horrible thing. This one, I think I'll have it. All right. Oh, I'm gonna try to force it. So I'm getting a little bit of weird coloring along the tree there. If I defringe it, I'm getting a little bit of gray on the branch. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. It's not as pronounced. Bruce, do you have a picture that you want to share?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I'm on my iPad anyway.
Okay. Spinning death. Well, I don't have any chromatic aberration issues, I guess. I know I do. I know I have them. I usually just get rid of them.
So 2-sentence description on what it is?
It's a phenomenon that occurs with the colors between one spot in your picture and the adjacent spot in your picture.
Okay.
And it typically occurs with cheaper lenses. You won't see it at all typically with the high quality lenses.
Yeah, usually I see it in the stuff that I've taken either with my phone, or stuff that I've taken with a point and shoot, because the quality of the glass just isn't very good. And I don't even have any pictures that I've taken with my phone imported into Lightroom right now. So it's kind of weird. I do get them with my big glass. So the other thing that can cause them, this is the other thing that can cause chromatic aberration is taking your lens all the way to the extreme. So for instance, I have that 60 to 600 that I shoot for most of the, the motocross stuff that I do, because I need that stretch just so I don't get ran over. And if I go all the way to 600 and there's trees in the background, I am almost always going to have some weird chromatic aberration where the trees meet the sky or where the horizon meets the sky, because I'm pushing that lens all the way to its edge. It's just like, you don't want to shoot if your lens goes from f2.8 to f22, you don't want to shoot at 22. You want to shoot one stop down from 22, because you start pushing your lens to the very edge, and sometimes you get some weird outcomes with the chromatic aberrations or the vignettes, or some other thing that could happen as far as color and how the image turns out when it comes out of the camera. So that's kind of the same issue. Okay, I could look at look for chromatic aberration all day. I'm not going to bore you with that.
All right, that's fine.
But I bet I can find you a picture, Ken, and send it to you and show you the difference. If you pull this too far, you will end up with a gray band because it will pull all the color. If it's a purple, if it's more of a purple chromatic aberration and you move this slider, it's basically desaturating that aberration, that artifact that was created. So the further you move it, the less color you're pulling out of it, you're going to end up with gray, and you'll see it. So you want to, if you're going to adjust something and you see chromatic aberration in an image, you want to do it zoomed in so that you can see what it's doing. Because if you go too far, when you get that picture printed, you'll see a gray band instead of a green band. I'll find one and put it on the computer so at our next meeting I can show it. I know I have one somewhere.
You don't take pictures with that flaws in them, do you?
All the time. I delete most of them.
Oh, that's the problem. Okay.
Okay, moving on. Where are we at? It's 8 o'clock. All right, lens corrections. I'm just going to go through these kind of quick. We talked about the transform tool last time. So you've got different ones here that will allow you to change how it's positioned. Like if it's a building and you're taking it looking up, it's going to stretch it. So it'll help you change the perspective. It'll help you put your horizon correct. If you don't want to crop the image, it's still going to crop it for you. But you can use, like it thinks that the door needs to be straight up and down. I used full. And if I use auto, it does the same thing. So Kenny, here's a good example of when this doesn't work.
Oh, I know. When it screws up big time.
Yeah, it does indeed.
And there's no doubt that, no, I didn't want that.
Yep. You've got your effects. If you're doing portrait work, you're probably applying some sort of a vignette. And you can do the vignette in Lightroom and Photoshop both a couple of different ways. You can use the mask tool, which is the new way that I do it, because I can decide where I want my vignette to be instead of just right on the corners. And I can invert that mask, and then I can apply my own vignette, versus if I use the one that Photoshop and Lightroom want to apply for me, which is only on the edges, and then I have to play with it. But you can see that it's still pretty much centered on the image. The only nice thing about this one is if you apply this one and then you crop the image, it remembers how you had it set. So it doesn't leave the vignette right where it was. When you crop it, it moves the vignette with the crop. If you apply the mask, your vignette's not going to be in this. I mean, it's going to be in the same place, but it'll look different. And then we've got calibration. This one is your color calibrations. So for instance, I'm shooting Canon, and if I change based on profile to a different version of color, it's going to calibrate accordingly. And I don't ever use this one. I haven't ever found the need to use it. So that takes us through all our tools. Do you guys have any questions? Nope. Okay. I will probably set another one up for August because September is going to be crazy. And I was going to go over the things over here on this side, specifically presets and the snapshot stuff. You've got your history here. It's just like Photoshop. It tracks everything that you do, so you can go backwards if you want to. And then the collections was one of the things that I wanted to go over. And another thing that I didn't touch on the initial ingest, I want to go over this as well. And that is because you've got the same collections here, but you've also got published services. So we're gonna talk about this one. And that's it for today.
Well, I'll probably have questions once I've played with some of this stuff. The problem is that I've been working on pictures and now I want to go back and start over. And I only have like 400 pictures from my trip, so and I'm only halfway through.
Oh, yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad. Yeah, I'll go over a few other tips for post-process for when you're going through stuff that I use. And I think Bruce, I'm sure, does it differently for marking pictures and, figuring out how you want to organize them. We'll kind of go that path next time. Talk about the stuff on the left of the develop screen. Go back to the library screen and talk about these things over here. And then we'll talk about some organization stuff. And then after that, we'll go into these other tools that are over here. I don't really use these a whole lot, but they're kind of handy. They're pretty neat. So, all right, cool. Well, thanks for coming to the class, and I'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
Right. Talk to you
Bye,
later.
Okay.
Thank you.